We have killed our Defender. And before I get in any trouble, it's not really a Defender. It's actually a Land Rover 90. This is an 87 E-Reg. This is pre-Defender. But as those of you who love Defenders know, no Defender ever actually dies. We're going to bring this one back to life. Let me give you a bit of history of this Land Rover, affectionately known as Daisy. Kind of because it's a bit white and yellow and patchy and old. It's a faithful old cow, this one. This workhorse came into our possession in 2020. We picked it up as probably at the time, the cheapest Defender on eBay in the UK. It needed a bit of love. It only had a week left on the MOT, so we took a bit of a punt on that. Having seen the chassis was in good nick. Sailed through the MOT, only then after did I notice it had a brake leak on the master cylinder, so we replaced that. And pretty much, other than that and one suspension shock, for the first few months, that was all it needed. As you can see from some of these pictures, we had a wonderful time washing it, cleaning it, getting it ready for use. I got the opportunity to drive all the way to the Netherlands, so thought, hey, you know what? I'll take the new Defender. Let's give it a go. Drove all the way there, had a great trip, drove around some beautiful canals and beautiful towns, until one fateful day heading along the canal when I got a battery light came on, and I stopped, popped the bonnet, didn't see anything, shut the bonnet, kept going, and quite quickly after, smoke started emerging from the bonnet. And it then occurred to me that the alternator had seized. So I thought, you know what, let's try and get this as far as we can. I kept driving it with the belt running over the stationary alternator until the belt eventually snapped. And then of course I had a problem with it going to overheat, because that same belt runs not just the alternator, the power steering, but also the water pump, and the water pump's the important one, because I can survive without the power steering, I can survive without the alternator, because this is a diesel. It just needs to be started. Once it's started, it doesn't really need power apart from the lights. So once I pulled over, it was starting to overheat, so I thought I'll fix this. I'll try and find some duct tape to make a belt. Couldn't find my duct tape in the car, there wasn't any. So I found some cotton sheets, some rags, tore some long strips out, twisted them and knotted them into place as a belt, and managed to drive another 2 or 3 miles with that to get a little bit closer to my destination. Unfortunately, the cloth belt was not going to get me back to the UK from the Netherlands. So I phoned the RAC, because you have European cover, you have to have European cover, and they politely said that they could either drop me back to the UK or drop me back to one destination on my trip. And I decided to take the punt, because I was planning on driving back to the UK with a trailer. I had all this other stuff planned. So we thought, well, I'll try and repair it. So I got towed back and dropped the car off back at the side of this beautiful canal here, you can see. And they told me I had no choice but to fix it. So I tried in my best broken Dutch, or should I say absolutely no Dutch, with an awful lot of help from a very friendly local. Phoned around a whole load of suppliers, managed to pick up an alternator, took the most expensive Uber in the world to go and get that alternator set up by the side of the canal, toolboxes, nearly fell in the canal whilst replacing this alternator. Halfway through fitting it, I realised that the ear for the adjuster on the alternator, for the bit you use to tension the belt, was on the wrong side. So we had the right connector, the right swing, but not the right adjuster bolt. So I had to throw it together and use what I had, because at this point this alternator had cost me a small fortune. And it was the only way I was going to get my ferry, which was in like a day and a half at that point. Threw it together, and by some miracle, leveraging a piece of an old curtain rail and whatever bolts I had lying back in the back of the car, made a bracket for it, which is still on there to this day. And that isn't the reason why this car has now sadly died. So after all that adventuring, we decided this was a very capable car. A very good friend of ours decided he wanted to go and try a little bit of off-roading on the Salisbury Plains, so we took it, and wow, it got stuck. several times.
Are you stuck?
I haven't tried going backwards yet. Yeah, I am.
Mate, you know you are never gonna live this down, didn't you?
And had to be towed out several times by our good friend Darren. He still holds that against us to this day. But his Land Cruiser simply had a higher clearance underneath, which meant he was able to get over things that sadly old Daisy couldn't. And that's kind of what inspired us to go and buy a much bigger, much more ridiculous Defender Rex. After our most recent off-roading with 4x4 without a club in Aldermaston, the radiator on this one got rather clogged. And by rather clogged, I mean very clogged. And it proceeded to overheat on the way home. It proceeded to overheat several times for the next week. We managed to limp it about, and I'd cleaned the radiator several times and actually in the end had to take the radiator grill off entirely to be able to get it clean enough. Yes, please. Jo had to take Daisy to work because her car was in the body shop having its black roof and its sills all done, and she arrived home one day and threw the keys at me and said, "It's trying to kill me, you have to park it on the driveway." And I thought, well, she's being a little bit exaggerating here a little bit, maybe. Let's find out what's going on. So I took the keys, jumped in it, and it was fine. Nothing was going on. And she said it had been bucking and trying to drive away, and I'm like, I didn't see anything. Anyway, I touched the throttle and it immediately hit the rev limiter. The engine, this old, very old TDI 2.5 turbo, had started to run on its own oil. And as you can see here, when we opened the bonnet and had a little bit of a look at the turbocharger, you could see why. The turbocharger bearings had completely failed, which meant we had full oil pressure oil being pumped directly into the inlet manifold because it doesn't have an intercooler. There was nowhere to catch it. It was going straight into the inlet. So the car was effectively running on its own engine oil, and it would quite happily have detonated if it was given a chance. So I gave it an oil change, a new filter, took the turbo off, made a blanking plate to replace where the turbo was and blocked off the oil lines. Sadly, it was a little bit too late. The amount of over revving that had happened, the amount of rubbish that had gone through the oil, sadly meant that the bearings had gone. And I tried to move the car, and in case you ever wonder what a terminal engine sounds like, that's it. We have blown a bearing of sorts, and it is kaput. So we are limping it home to go and put a V8 engine in it. Hopefully it makes it. If it doesn't, then we're towing it. Very shortly after that recording, only literally a matter of seconds, I'm gutted I'd stopped the video then, the engine seized entirely and needed to be limped home.